Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The Simpsons paradox. A pharmaceutical company tests a new drug, comparing it to an existing treatment, and the study involves two populations, men and women, and when the results are analysed separately by gender, the new drug outperforms the old treatment in both groups. Men who take the new drug recover more frequently than men who take the old treatment, and women who take the new drug also recover more frequently than women who take the old treatment. And so it seems clear that the new drug is superior, effective for both men and women, better than the alternative, and yet when the data from both groups are combined, when the overall recovery rates are calculated across the entire study population, the old treatment appears to outperform the new drug, showing higher overall recovery rates. And this reversal, where a trend that holds in every subgroup disappears or reverses when the subgroups are combined, is Simpson's paradox, named after the statistician Edward Simpson, who described it formally in 1951, though the phenomenon had been noted earlier by others. And the paradox reveals how aggregating data can mislead, how the whole can tell a different story than the parts, and how statistical reasoning requires careful attention to confounding variables and the structure of causal relationships. The resolution of the paradox lies in understanding that the populations are not balanced, that more men than women take the new drug, or more women than men take the old treatment, or that the recovery rates differ between genders for reasons unrelated to the drugs. And this imbalance means that the overall average is dominated by the group with higher representation. And if men have higher recovery rates in general, and most men take the new drug, then the new drug will appear effective overall, even if it is actually less effective than the old treatment when gender is controlled for. Or if the distribution is skewed in other ways, the opposite reversal can occur. And the paradox shows that crude averages can be misleading. That Simpson's paradox occurs whenever there is a lurking variable, a confounding factor that influences both the treatment assignment and the outcome, and failing to account for this variable leads to incorrect conclusions. Consider a simpler example involving college admissions. Suppose a university has two departments, and Department A admits 70% of applicants, while Department B admits 30%. And when applications are examined by gender, it appears that the university discriminates against women, because the overall acceptance rate for women is lower than for men. But when the data are broken down by department, a different picture emerges. In Department A, which is less selective, a higher percentage of female applicants are admitted than male applicants, and in Department B, which is more selective, the same is true. Women are admitted at higher rates than men in both departments, and the overall appearance of discrimination arises because more women apply to Department B, which has a lower acceptance rate, while more men apply to Department A, which has a higher acceptance rate. And so even though women are favoured in both departments, they appear disfavoured overall. And this is Simpson's paradox. The confounding variable is the choice of department, which correlates with both gender and acceptance rate. And ignoring this variable produces a misleading aggregate statistic. The paradox has profound implications for how we interpret statistical data, for medical research where treatment effects can appear or disappear depending on how data are aggregated, for social science where trends in subgroups can reverse when combined, for legal cases where evidence of discrimination or bias can seem to vanish or appear depending on how populations are divided. And the paradox shows that there is no neutral or objective way to report statistics, that the choice of whether to aggregate or disaggregate, whether to control for certain variables or not, is a substantive decision that affects what conclusions can be drawn, and this decision should be guided by causal understanding, by knowledge of which variables are confounders and which are mediators. And this knowledge cannot be derived from the statistics alone, but requires background theory, domain expertise, and careful thinking about causal structure. Simpson's paradox also raises questions about the nature of causation and the relationship between correlation and causation, because the paradox shows that correlations can reverse when additional variables are considered, that associations in data are sensitive to what is held constant and what is allowed to vary, and this means that identifying causal relationships from observational data is more difficult than it might seem, that confounders must be identified and controlled for, that causal inference requires not just statistical analysis but causal modelling, the specification of hypotheses about how variables influence each other. And the paradox is one reason why randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard for establishing causation, because randomization ensures that treatment assignment is independent of confounding variables, breaking the associations that generate Simpson's paradox. The paradox appears in many real-world contexts. In sports statistics, where a player can have a better batting average than another player in every season, yet a worse average over their entire career, because they played different numbers of games in different seasons. In economic data, where wages can increase for every demographic group, yet average wages can decrease overall, because the composition of the workforce shifts toward lower wage groups. In epidemiology, where a treatment can appear harmful overall, yet beneficial in every subgroup, because sicker patients are more likely to receive the treatment, and in each case the paradox reveals the danger of naive data interpretation, the risk of drawing conclusions from aggregate statistics without understanding the underlying structure. Some philosophers and statisticians argue that Simpson's paradox is not really a paradox, but a reminder of the importance of causal thinking, that the appearance of paradox arises only when we treat statistical associations as if they were causal relationships, that once we distinguish between correlation and causation, between conditional independence and causal independence, the paradox dissolves, and the correct answer to whether the new drug is better than the old treatment depends on the causal structure, on whether gender is a confounder that should be controlled for, or a mediator that should not be, and this depends on the mechanisms by which the drugs work and the reasons why gender affects recovery rates. Simpson's paradox has also been used to critique certain statistical practices, to question the use of aggregate statistics in policymaking, to highlight the need for transparent reporting of how data are broken down and what variables are controlled for, and to emphasize that statistical analysis is not a neutral technical exercise, but involves interpretive choices that reflect background assumptions and values, and different choices can support different conclusions, even from the same data. And this does not mean that statistics are arbitrary or that all interpretations are equally valid, but it does mean that statistical reasoning requires judgment, requires thinking about causal mechanisms, requires transparency about methods, and requires humility about the limits of what data alone can tell us. The data sit in tables, broken down by subgroups, aggregated across populations, and the numbers tell different stories depending on how they are arranged. And Simpson's paradox reminds us that statistics are not self-interpreting, that averages can mislead, that trends can reverse, and that understanding data requires more than calculation, requires causal reasoning, domain knowledge, and careful attention to structure. And the paradox persists as a warning, a puzzle that appears in textbook examples and real-world disasters, a reminder that numbers lie, or rather, that we lie to ourselves when we treat numbers as transparent windows onto reality rather than as constructed representations that must be interpreted with care. And the reversal of trends continues to surprise, continues to catch analysts off guard, continues to generate misleading headlines and faulty policies, and Simpson's paradox endures, not because the mathematics is obscure, but because the temptation to aggregate, to simplify, to collapse complex data into simple averages is overwhelming, and the paradox stands as a permanent challenge to that temptation, a proof that simplification can distort, that the whole is not always the sum of the parts, and that statistical reasoning, done properly, requires vigilance, sophistication, and an understanding of causation that transcends mere correlation. The stadium paradox. Zeno of Elea constructed another puzzle about motion, one less famous than his other paradoxes, but perhaps more perplexing, and this is the stadium paradox, sometimes called the moving rows paradox, a thought experiment involving 3 rows of objects moving past each other that seems to prove that half a moment equals a whole moment, that time itself is inconsistent. Imagine 3 rows of objects arranged in a stadium, each row containing the same number of objects. Let us say 4 objects in each row for simplicity, and the first row remains stationary, while the second row moves to the right and the third row moves to the left, each moving at the same speed. At the starting moment, the rows are aligned, but after 1 unit of time, the second row has moved 1 position to the right and the third row has moved 1 position to the left. And here is where the paradox emerges. From the perspective of the stationary first row, each moving row has passed 1 object, but from the perspective of the second row moving right, the third row moving left has passed 2 objects. Because the relative motion between the second and third rows is twice as fast as the motion of either row relative to the stationary row. Zeno argued that this leads to a contradiction, because if the smallest unit of time is the time it takes for one object to pass another, then relative to the first row, 1 unit of time has passed, but relative to the second row, 2 units of time have passed, as measured by how many objects of the third row have gone by. And so the same interval is both 1 unit and 2 units, half of itself and equal to itself, and time becomes incoherent. The paradox is more difficult to grasp than Zeno's other arguments, and even ancient commentators struggled to articulate exactly what the problem was supposed to be, and Aristotle's response was somewhat dismissive, pointing out that the speed of an object depends on the frame of reference, that there is no absolute motion but only motion relative to other objects, and that the time it takes to pass an object in motion is different from the time it takes to pass a stationary object, and therefore there is no contradiction, merely a confusion about relative velocities. Modern physics has vindicated Aristotle's intuition through the principle of relativity, which states that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial reference frames, and that there is no privileged stationary frame. All motion is relative, and the speed at which objects pass each other depends on the observer's frame of reference. Yet some interpreters suggest that Zeno's stadium paradox was actually an early glimpse of the relativity of motion, an attempt to show that if motion is real, then there can be no absolute measure of speed or time, and that this was meant to support Parmenides' claim that motion is an illusion. Others argue that the paradox reveals an implicit assumption about the discrete nature of space and time, that Zeno may have been imagining space as a grid of discrete positions and time as a sequence of discrete moments, and that the paradox arises from trying to reconcile continuous motion with discrete structure, a tension that would not be fully addressed until the development of calculus and later quantum mechanics. The paradox also touches on the concept of relative velocity, the idea that the speed of one object relative to another is the sum of their individual speeds if they are moving in opposite directions, and that this is perfectly consistent even though it means different observers measure different relative speeds. In a sense, the stadium paradox is less about motion itself and more about the consistency of measurement, the question of whether time and space have absolute units, or whether all measurements are relative to the observer. And this question would not be fully answered until Einstein's theories of special and general relativity in the 20th century, which showed that time itself is not absolute, but depends on the relative motion and gravitational fields of the observer. Zeno's Stadium sits quietly in the history of philosophy, overshadowed by his more famous paradoxes, yet it contains within it the seeds of ideas that would take 2,000 years to fully develop: the relativity of motion, the frame dependence of measurement, the question of whether space and time are discrete or continuous, and the paradox remains a reminder that even the simplest scenarios, 3 rows of objects moving past each other, can conceal deep questions about the nature of reality, questions that our intuitions cannot easily answer, questions that require centuries of thought and mathematics to even begin to unravel. The surprise examination paradox. A teacher announces to a class on Friday afternoon that there will be a surprise examination sometime during the following week, and the examination will be a surprise in the sense that the students will not know on which day it will occur until the morning of the examination itself. And this announcement seems straightforward, even cruel perhaps, but harmless from a logical standpoint. Yet one clever student raises a hand and argues that the surprise examination is impossible, that it cannot occur, and the reasoning goes as follows. The examination cannot be on Friday because if it has not occurred by the end of Thursday, then the students will know it must be on Friday, and therefore it will not be a surprise, and if Friday is ruled out, then the examination cannot be on Thursday either, because if it has not occurred by the end of Wednesday, then the students will know it must be on Thursday, since Friday has been eliminated, and therefore it will not be a surprise. And this reasoning continues backward through the week, eliminating Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday in turn, until the student concludes that the surprise examination cannot occur on any day of the week, that the teacher's announcement is self-contradictory, that a surprise examination is logically impossible. The class relaxes, confident in this reasoning, and then on Wednesday morning the teacher administers the examination, and the students are indeed surprised, and this outcome seems to vindicate the teacher and refute the student's argument. Yet the student's reasoning appeared sound. Each step seemed to follow logically from the previous one, and so a paradox emerges. The surprise examination both is and is not possible. The student's proof that it cannot occur is seemingly valid, yet the examination does occur and is genuinely surprising, and philosophers and logicians have puzzled over this paradox for decades, proposing various resolutions but reaching no consensus. One approach is to question what surprise means, to argue that the student's reasoning equivocates between different senses of surprise or knowledge, that ruling out Friday does not give the students the kind of knowledge that would make Thursday non-surprising, because the teacher could change plans, could decide not to give an examination at all, could be mistaken about the week, and so even if the students can deduce that the examination must be on Thursday if it occurs that week, they do not know with certainty that it will occur, and this residual uncertainty preserves the possibility of surprise. Another approach focuses on the self-referential nature of the announcement, arguing that the student's reasoning involves a kind of paradox of self-reference, similar to the liar paradox, because the teacher's announcement refers to the student's knowledge state, claiming that they will not know when the examination occurs, and the student's reasoning attempts to derive knowledge about the examination from the announcement itself, creating a loop where the truth of the announcement depends on whether the students believe it, and this loop generates instability, making it impossible to consistently assign truth values to the claims involved. Still another approach suggests that the student's backward induction reasoning is flawed, that while it is true that the examination cannot be on Friday, if the students know this in advance, the elimination of Friday does not straightforwardly imply that Thursday can also be eliminated, because the reasoning that rules out Thursday depends on the students believing that Friday is ruled out. But if the examination could in fact occur on Friday, despite the reasoning, then the entire chain of deductions collapses. And this highlights a problem with self-fulfilling or self-defeating prophecies, situations where believing a conclusion affects whether the conclusion is true. The surprise examination paradox also connects to issues in epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because the paradox involves nested levels of knowledge. The teacher knows that the students do not know when the examination will occur, the students know that the teacher knows this, and so on, and reasoning about such nested knowledge structures is notoriously tricky, prone to paradoxes and fallacies, and formal epistemic logic provides tools for analysing these structures, but also reveals their complexity and the ease with which intuitive reasoning can go astray. The paradox has applications beyond the classroom, appearing in game theory and strategic reasoning, where players must reason about what other players know and believe, and where backward induction arguments, similar to the students' reasoning, are used to solve sequential games. But these arguments can lead to counterintuitive results, situations where seemingly sound reasoning produces predictions that are violated in practice, and the surprise examination paradox serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of such reasoning. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of surprise itself, whether surprise is a psychological state, a relation between expectations and events, or a logical property of statements and situations, and whether it is coherent to announce in advance that something will be surprising, because the act of announcing seems to undermine the surprise, yet in practice surprise examinations do occur and are surprising, and so perhaps surprise is not as fragile as the student's reasoning suggests. Perhaps it is compatible with some forms of foreknowledge, with knowing that something will happen without knowing when or how. The teacher's announcement, the student's reasoning, and the actual occurrence of the examination on Wednesday form a triangle of tension, each element seemingly incompatible with the others, yet all actually occurring, and the paradox remains unresolved, a puzzle that continues to generate papers and debates, a simple scenario that conceals deep issues about knowledge, belief, time, and the logic of self-reference. And it stands as a reminder that reasoning, even careful logical reasoning, can lead us astray when the premises involve reflexive concepts, when statements refer to their own truth or to the knowledge states of those who hear them, and that the gap between theory and practice, between what logic seems to prove and what actually happens, can reveal faults in our logical frameworks or in our understanding of concepts like knowledge and surprise, or perhaps in the very idea that logic can fully capture the complexities of situations involving human belief and expectation, and the examination comes unexpected despite the announcement, surprising despite the reasoning, and the students, shocked and unprepared, realize that the paradox is not merely abstract but painfully real, and the teacher smiles, victorious, having somehow managed to do the impossible, to give a surprise examination that was announced in advance, and yet remained a surprise, and the paradox endures, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a crack in the edifice of logical reasoning that no amount of analysis has yet managed to seal. The symbol grounding problem. Why computers never know what words really mean. A computer system is given a dictionary, a complete dictionary that defines every word in terms of other words, and the system can look up any word, follow the chains of definitions, process the relationships between symbols, and the system appears to understand language, can answer questions by manipulating symbols according to rules, can translate between languages by mapping symbols to symbols, can even generate coherent text by following patterns learned from training data. And yet philosopher Stephen Harnad asks a crucial question. Does the system understand what any symbol means? Does it know what the words refer to? Or is it merely shuffling meaningless tokens according to syntactic rules? And this is the symbol grounding problem. The question of how symbols, whether in computers or in minds, acquire meaning, how they connect to the world, how they come to be about something rather than being mere formal marks, And the problem challenges purely symbolic theories of cognition, challenges the idea that thinking is symbol manipulation, and points to the need for grounding, for connecting symbols to non-symbolic experiences, to perceptions and actions, to interactions with the world that give symbols their meaning. Imagine looking up the word zebra in the dictionary, and the dictionary says a zebra is a striped equine mammal, and you look up striped and find marked with parallel bands, and you look up equine and find relating to horses, and you look up mammal and find warm-blooded vertebrate animal, and you can continue this process indefinitely, following chains of definitions, symbol to symbol to symbol. And if you have never seen a zebra, never encountered stripes or horses or animals, then all these definitions are empty, are just more words whose meanings you do not grasp, and the whole dictionary becomes a closed system of symbols referring to other symbols with no connection to reality. And this is the situation of a purely symbolic computer system. It has access to definitions, to relationships between symbols, but it has no grounding, no connection to the real zebras and stripes and horses that the symbols are supposed to be about. The symbol grounding problem challenges strong AI, the claim that implementing the right program, manipulating symbols according to the right rules, is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and Harnad argues that symbol manipulation alone is not enough, that understanding requires grounding, requires that at least some symbols be connected to non-symbolic experiences, to sensory inputs and motor outputs, to perceptions of the world and actions in the world, and these grounded symbols can then give meaning to other symbols through their relationships. And a hybrid system, with both grounded and symbolic components, can achieve genuine understanding, but a purely symbolic system cannot, remains forever trapped in a web of meaningless symbols, playing symbol games without comprehension. Visualize two systems. One is a person who has seen zebras, has perceived their stripes, has distinguished them from horses, and when this person uses the word zebra, it is grounded in these experiences, refers to real animals encountered in the world. And the other system is a computer that has only manipulated symbols, has processed text containing the word zebra, has learned statistical patterns, but has never perceived a zebra, never interacted with one. And when this system uses zebra, it is ungrounded, refers to nothing beyond other symbols. And Harnad's claim is that these two uses are fundamentally different, that the person understands what zebra means, and the computer does not. And the difference is grounding, is connection to non-symbolic reality. The symbol grounding problem connects to arguments in philosophy of mind, like Searle's Chinese room, which argues that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that manipulating symbols, according to rules, does not produce understanding, and both arguments challenge computational theories of mind, challenge the idea that cognition is just symbol manipulation, and both point to the need for something more, something beyond symbols. Though they disagree about what that something is, Searle appeals to intrinsic intentionality and consciousness, while Harnad appeals to sensorimotor grounding and interaction with the world. One response to the symbol grounding problem accepts it and argues that AI systems need embodiment, need sensors and actuators, need to interact with the physical world, and recent developments in robotics and embodied AI pursue this approach, creating systems that learn through perception and action, that ground their symbols in sensory experience. And these systems can associate words with visual features, can learn that zebra refers to things with certain visible properties, and this grounding, even if limited compared to human grounding, provides a foundation for meaning that purely symbolic systems lack. Another response challenges the problem, argues that grounding is not necessary for meaning, that symbol systems can have meaningful representations through their functional roles, through how symbols are used in inference and reasoning, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of symbols and their relationships. And a sufficiently complex symbolic system can have meaningful representations even without grounding in perception and action, and this response defends computationalism, defends the idea that cognition is symbol manipulation, and denies that something extra, something beyond symbols, is needed for genuine understanding. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of meaning, between dictionary meaning, which can be captured symbolically, and grounded meaning, which requires connection to experience, and argues that both kinds exist. Both are legitimate and purely symbolic systems, can have dictionary meaning even if they lack grounded meaning, and for many purposes dictionary meaning is sufficient, is all that is needed for tasks like translation or information retrieval, and so the symbol grounding problem, while real, is less threatening than it appears, shows limits on what purely symbolic systems can do, but does not show that such systems are meaningless or useless. The symbol grounding problem also has implications for language learning, for understanding how children acquire meaning, because children do not learn language from dictionaries, do not master symbols by relating them to other symbols, but learn by associating words with experiences, by hearing zebra while seeing zebras, by using words in context, by grounding language in perception and action. And this grounding happens early, provides a foundation of basic concepts, and more abstract concepts are built on this foundation through symbol-symbol relationships. And so human language combines grounding and symbolic structure, uses both perceptual and abstract meaning, and neither alone is sufficient. The computer processes text, generates responses, manipulates symbols with impressive fluency, and yet the question remains whether it understands anything, whether its symbols mean anything beyond their formal relationships, and Harnad's symbol grounding problem suggests not, suggests that without grounding in non-symbolic experience, the symbols are empty, are syntactic objects without semantic content. And the problem persists as a challenge to AI, as a question about what would be needed for machines to genuinely understand, whether symbol manipulation supplemented with machine learning is enough, or whether something else, something like embodied interaction with the world, is necessary. And the problem remains unresolved, remains debated, remains a permanent feature of discussions about AI and cognition, about meaning and understanding, about the relationship between symbols and what they represent. And the symbol grounding problem endures as a reminder that meaning is not just a matter of relationships between symbols, but requires connection to a non-symbolic ground, requires that symbols hook onto the world, requires that language touch reality, and whether computers can achieve this grounding, whether they can move beyond symbol manipulation to genuine understanding, remains one of the central questions in artificial intelligence and philosophy of mind. The tragedy of the commons, why shared resources destroy themselves. A village shares a common pasture, open to all herders, and each herder can graze their animals freely, can use the resource without restriction, and each herder reasons individually, calculates privately that adding one more animal to their herd brings them full benefit, brings them more milk and meat and wealth, while the cost of overgrazing is shared among all herders, is distributed across the community, and so each herder gains fully from expansion but pays only a fraction of the cost. And this asymmetry, this structure of incentives, drives each rational herder to add more animals, to maximize their individual benefit, and every herder reasons this way. Every herder expands their herd, and the commons becomes overgrazed, becomes depleted, becomes destroyed. And what was a productive shared resource becomes barren, becomes useless to everyone. And this is the tragedy of the commons, described by Garrett Hardin in 1968, a pattern where individually rational decisions lead to collective disaster, where the pursuit of self-interest in using shared resources results in the destruction of those resources. And the tragedy applies not just to grazing pastures, but to fisheries that are overfished, to aquifers that are depleted, to atmospheres that are polluted, to any shared resource where individual benefits are private but costs are collective, and the tragedy reveals a fundamental problem in resource management, shows that voluntary restraint is insufficient, shows that without collective governance, shared resources tend toward destruction, and solving the tragedy requires institutions, requires mechanisms that align individual incentives with collective sustainability. Imagine the herder's calculation more precisely. The commons can sustain a certain number of animals, and beyond that capacity, the pasture degrades, produces less grass, supports fewer animals, and when operating below capacity, each additional animal brings net benefit to its owner without significant cost to others. But when operating at or above capacity, each additional animal brings benefit to its owner while imposing costs on all herders through degradation. And the individual herder receives the full benefit, receives all the milk and meat from their additional animal, but pays only their proportional share of the degradation cost. And if there are 10 herders, then each pays 1/10 of the degradation cost. And so the individual benefit exceeds the individual cost, even when the collective cost exceeds the collective benefit. And this creates the incentive structure that drives the tragedy, that makes it individually rational to add animals even when doing so harms the collective. And every herder faces this incentive. Every herder adds animals, and the commons collapses under the weight of rational individual decisions. The tragedy of the commons demonstrates the difference between individual and collective rationality, shows that actions can be rational from an individual perspective, while being disastrous from a collective perspective. And this divergence is the core of the tragedy, is what makes the situation tragic rather than merely unfortunate. And the tragedy is not caused by irrationality or malice, but by rational pursuit of self-interest, in a context where individual and collective interests misalign. And Hardin's insight was that this misalignment is structural, is inherent in the nature of common pool resources, and cannot be solved by appeals to conscience or voluntary restraint, because any individual who restrains themselves while others do not simply sacrifices their own benefit without saving the commons. And this creates a race to the bottom, creates pressure to exploit resources before others do, and the tragedy unfolds inevitably unless institutions intervene. Visualize the tragedy as a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, where each individual faces the choice between restraint, limiting their use of the commons for collective benefit, or exploitation, maximizing their individual use at collective cost. And exploitation dominates restraint, because regardless of what others do, you are better off exploiting. If others restrain themselves, you benefit from the preserved commons while taking more than your share. And if others exploit, then the commons is doomed anyway, and restraint only makes you worse off relative to others. And so everyone exploits. Everyone takes more than sustainable, and the commons is destroyed. And this structure shows that the tragedy is a coordination problem, is a failure to achieve collective action, and solving it requires changing the incentive structure, requires making restraint individually rational. And this can be achieved through various mechanisms, through private property that internalizes costs, through regulation that enforces limits, through community management that creates monitoring and sanctions, through taxation that makes exploitation costly. One response to the tragedy is privatization, converting commons into private property, assigning ownership to individuals who then bear the full costs and benefits of their decisions. And private owners have incentive to manage sustainably, because degradation reduces the value of their property. And this aligns individual and collective interests, makes conservation individually rational. And historical examples exist of commons being enclosed, being divided into private parcels. And while enclosure solves the tragedy, it raises questions of justice, of how property is assigned, of what happens to those who lose access. And privatization is not always feasible, is not appropriate for all resources, and some commons, like the atmosphere or the ocean, cannot be easily privatized, cannot be divided into individual holdings, and alternative solutions are needed. Another response is regulation, government intervention that imposes limits on use, that enforces sustainable practices through monitoring and penalties, and regulation can solve the tragedy by making exploitation illegal, by removing the incentive to overuse, and examples include fishing quotas, emission limits, grazing restrictions, and regulations can be effective when enforcement is strong, when violations are detected and punished, but regulation faces challenges, requires accurate information about sustainable use levels, requires political will to enforce, requires resistance to lobbying from those who benefit from exploitation, and regulations can be captured, can be weakened or undermined, and the tragedy can re-emerge if enforcement fails. A third response, emphasized by Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for this work, is community management, where local communities develop institutions to govern commons, create rules for use, establish monitoring systems, sanction violators, and these community-managed commons can be sustainable for long periods, can avoid tragedy through social norms, through reputation mechanisms, through collective decision-making, and Ostrom documented many examples worldwide of successful commons management, showed that neither privatization nor government regulation is necessary, that communities can self-organize to solve tragedies, and her work challenged Hardin's pessimism, showed that tragedy is not inevitable, that the commons can be governed sustainably when appropriate institutions exist, and the key factors include clear boundaries defining who can use the resource, rules matched to local conditions, participation in rule-making by those affected, monitoring by accountable monitors, graduated sanctions for violations, conflict resolution mechanisms, and recognition of rights to organize by external authorities. The tragedy also applies to global commons, to resources that transcend local or national boundaries. And climate change is the paradigmatic example. The atmosphere is a global commons, and each nation benefits from emitting greenhouse gases, benefits from economic activity that produces emissions. While the costs of climate change are distributed globally, are borne by all nations, and this creates the tragedy structure, makes it individually rational for each nation to emit even when collective emissions drive catastrophic change. And solving this global tragedy requires international cooperation, requires agreements that bind nations to reduce emissions, requires mechanisms for enforcement and monitoring, and achieving such cooperation is extraordinarily difficult, requires overcoming free rider problems, requires building trust among nations with divergent interests, and the failure to adequately address climate change demonstrates the difficulty of solving tragedies at global scale, shows that the larger the commons and the more diverse the users, the harder it is to achieve collective governance. The tragedy also has temporal dimensions, affects intergenerational equity, because current overuse depletes resources for future generations, and future people cannot participate in current decisions, cannot bargain or negotiate, cannot protect their interests, and this creates an asymmetry where present benefits come at future costs, and market mechanisms and democratic processes are biased toward the present, give insufficient weight to future generations. And avoiding intergenerational tragedy requires institutional commitment to sustainability, requires valuing future welfare, requires resisting the temptation to consume resources now at the expense of those not yet born, and this is perhaps the deepest tragedy, that future people cannot defend themselves against present exploitation. The commons continues to degrade, the herders continue to add animals, the pasture becomes barren, and the tragedy unfolds, driven by rational individual decisions, driven by the misalignment of individual and collective interests, and every herder suffers, loses their livelihood, destroys what sustained them, and the tragedy remains one of the most important concepts in environmental and resource economics. remains a framework for understanding why shared resources are vulnerable, why voluntary restraint is insufficient, why institutions matter, and the tragedy applies to fisheries emptied, to aquifers drained, to forests cleared, to atmospheres polluted, and avoiding tragedy requires collective action, requires governance that aligns incentives, requires institutions that make sustainability individually rational. And without such institutions, the commons tends toward destruction, and the tragedy of the commons endures as a permanent warning about the limits of individual rationality, about the need for collective governance, and about the structural challenges in managing shared resources. The trolley problem: would you kill one person to save five? A runaway trolley speeds down a track, out of control, and ahead on the track, 5 people are tied up, unable to move, unaware of the approaching danger, and the trolley will kill them all unless something is done. And you stand next to a lever that controls a switch, and if you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a side track, and on that side track, 1 person is tied up, and pulling the lever will save the 5 people, but will kill the 1 person, and you have seconds to decide. And the question is asked: should you pull the lever? Should you actively cause 1 person's death to prevent 5 deaths? And this is the trolley problem, a thought experiment in ethics first formulated by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later refined by Judith Jarvis Thomson. And the problem has generated endless debate about the nature of moral responsibility, about the difference between killing and letting die, about whether the consequences of an action are all that matter, or whether the act itself has moral significance, independent of outcomes. Visualize the scenario: the track stretches ahead, the 5 people bound and helpless, the trolley barreling toward them, unstoppable, and you at the switch, hand on the lever, and time slows as you deliberate. If you do nothing, 5 people die. If you pull the lever, 1 person dies, and the arithmetic seems simple. 5 is greater than 1. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 is a net gain. And by this consequentialist reasoning, you should pull the lever. You should minimize harm, maximize lives saved. And many people, when presented with this scenario, say they would pull the lever, would divert the trolley, would accept responsibility for causing 1 death to prevent 5. But now consider a variation, the Fat Man variant, also called the footbridge scenario, where you stand on a bridge above the tracks, and the trolley is approaching below, heading toward the 5 people, and next to you on the bridge stands a very large person, large enough that if pushed off the bridge, they would fall onto the tracks, and their body would stop the trolley, saving the 5 people, but killing the large person. And you could push this person, could use their body as an obstruction, and the outcome is the same as before. 5 people saved, 1 person killed, and yet when presented with this scenario, most people say they would not push, would not use the large person as a means to stop the trolley, even though the consequences are identical to the lever case. 5 saved, 1 killed, and this asymmetry, this difference in moral intuition between the 2 cases despite the same outcome, is what makes the trolley problem so philosophically interesting. It reveals that our moral judgments are not based purely on consequences, not purely on maximizing lives saved, but also on how those lives are saved, on whether the harm is direct or indirect, on whether someone is used as a means or merely affected as a side effect. The distinction involves the doctrine of double effect, a principle in ethics that says there is a moral difference between intending harm as a means to an end versus foreseeing harm as an unintended side effect. In the lever case, pulling the lever is intended to divert the trolley, and the death of the 1 person is a foreseen but unintended side effect. The 1 person dies because they happen to be on the diverted track, but their death is not the means by which the 5 are saved. The means is the diversion itself, whereas in the Fat Man case, pushing the person is intended precisely to use their body to stop the trolley. Their death is the means by which the 5 are saved, and this makes the act feel more like murder, more like using a person as a tool. And the doctrine of double effect says that intending harm as a means is morally worse than foreseeing harm as a side effect, even if the outcomes are identical. Critics argue that this distinction is spurious, that consequences are what matter, that if 5 lives are saved and 1 life is lost, the moral calculus is the same, regardless of how the result is achieved, and utilitarians, who judge actions by their consequences, say that both pulling the lever and pushing the large person are morally required if they maximize overall welfare, and any moral theory that forbids saving 5 lives to avoid directly causing 1 death is absurd, is giving too much weight to squeamishness or moral intuitions that evolved in contexts very different from modern ethical dilemmas. But defenders of deontological ethics, ethics based on duties and rules rather than consequences, argue that people have rights, that using someone as a means without their consent violates their dignity, that not all ways of achieving good outcomes are permissible, and that the fat man case is wrong precisely because it treats the large person as a mere tool, as an object to be sacrificed for the greater good. And this violates the Kantian principle that people are ends in themselves, never merely means. The trolley problem also raises questions about moral responsibility and causation, because in the lever case, you cause the death of the 1 person by pulling the lever, you redirect the trolley, but in the do-nothing case, you do not cause the death of the 5 people. The trolley causes their deaths, and you merely fail to prevent it. And some moral theories distinguish between killing and letting die, between acts and omissions, and say that killing is worse than letting die, that actively causing harm carries more moral weight than passively allowing harm. And by this reasoning, pulling the lever might be wrong because it involves killing, whereas doing nothing involves only letting die. But this asymmetry is controversial. Many philosophers argue that there is no deep moral difference between killing and letting die, that if you can prevent 5 deaths at the cost of 1 death, you should do so, regardless of whether the mechanism involves action or inaction. Visualize standing at the lever, frozen by indecision, the trolley approaching, the seconds ticking away, and your mind races through arguments, through principles, through gut reactions, and different moral frameworks give different answers. Consequentialism says pull, deontology says maybe not. Virtue ethics asks what a virtuous person would do, and the answer is not obvious, depends on which virtues are relevant: courage, compassion, respect for autonomy, and the problem reveals that our moral intuitions are not consistent, not unified by a single principle, but are a patchwork of different considerations, different values that sometimes conflict. And in hard cases like the trolley problem, these conflicts become explicit, become impossible to ignore, and we must choose which principle to prioritize, which value to uphold. And there is no algorithm, no formula that tells us the right answer, only judgment, only the difficult work of weighing competing considerations and making a choice we can live with. The trolley problem has been studied empirically. Psychologists have presented it to thousands of subjects, measuring their responses, looking for patterns, and the results confirm that most people distinguish between the lever and the fat man cases. Most would pull the lever, but not push the fat man. And brain imaging studies suggest that different parts of the brain are involved. The lever case activates regions associated with reasoning and calculation, while the fat man case activates regions associated with emotion and social cognition. And this suggests that our moral judgments involve both rational deliberation and emotional response, both utilitarian calculation and deontological intuition, and different scenarios trigger different systems. And the tension between these systems is what makes moral dilemmas difficult. What makes them dilemmas? Cases where no answer satisfies all our moral intuitions, where any choice involves sacrifice, involves accepting consequences or violating principles. And the trolley problem, artificial as it is, captures this structure, this irreducible difficulty that characterizes real moral life. The trolley speeds on, the people lie helpless, the lever waits, and the choice must be made: pull or don't pull, act or refrain, and the problem offers no comfort, no easy answer, only the recognition that morality is hard, that lives are at stake, that our choices matter, and that sometimes there is no right answer, only answers that feel less wrong. And the trolley problem endures, not because it resembles real dilemmas we face, but because it distills the structure of moral conflict, because it forces explicit the trade-offs we usually avoid, and because it reminds us that ethics is not a set of rules to be followed mechanically, but a practice requiring judgment, requiring courage, requiring the willingness to make difficult choices and accept responsibility for their consequences. And the trolley rolls, and the lever waits, and the question persists. The Sleeping Beauty problem. A woman volunteers for an unusual experiment in probability and subjective credence, an experiment that will test how she should reason about her own situation when her memory has been manipulated. And the setup is as follows. On Sunday she's put to sleep, and a fair coin is flipped. If the coin lands heads, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed briefly, and then the experiment ends. But if the coin lands tails, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed, given a drug that erases her memory of the Monday awakening, put back to sleep, awakened again on Tuesday, interviewed again, and then the experiment ends. And the crucial feature is that whenever she is awakened, she cannot tell whether it is Monday or Tuesday, cannot tell whether the coin landed heads or tails. She knows only that she is awake and being interviewed. And the question posed to philosophers and decision theorists is this: when Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed, what should her credence be that the coin landed heads? What probability should she assign to heads given her situation and her knowledge? The problem divides respondents into two camps, the halfers and the thirders, and each position has compelling arguments. Yet they reach opposite conclusions, creating a paradox that reveals deep tensions in how we think about probability, information, and self-locating belief. The halfers argue that Sleeping Beauty should maintain her prior credence of one half, because the coin is fair and nothing she learns upon awakening provides evidence about how it landed. She knew before the experiment that she would be awakened at least once, and being awakened is guaranteed regardless of the coin outcome, and so the awakening provides no new information, no reason to update her probability, and therefore she should stick with one half. And this reasoning seems straightforward, seems to respect the principle that probabilities should only change when new evidence is acquired, and being awakened is not new evidence because it was certain to happen. The thirders argue that Sleeping Beauty should assign credence 1/3 to heads, because there are three possible awakening situations: heads Monday, tails Monday, and tails Tuesday. And from her perspective, upon awakening, these three situations are indistinguishable. She cannot tell which one she is in, and by a principle of indifference among indistinguishable possibilities, she should assign equal probability to each, 1/3 to each. And since heads corresponds to only one of these situations, heads Monday, while tails corresponds to two, tails Monday and tails Tuesday, her credence in heads should be 1/3, and her credence in tails should be 2/3. And this reasoning seems to respect the information that if the coin landed tails, she is twice as likely to be awakened, that her current awakening is more probable under tails than under heads. And this should shift her credence toward tails. The disagreement between halfers and thirders reflects a deeper question about what credences represent and how they should be updated. Halfers tend to interpret credence as tracking objective chance, the physical probability of the coin flip, which is 1/2 and does not change based on Sleeping Beauty's subjective situation, while thirders interpret credence as tracking epistemic probability, the rational degree of belief given all available information, including self-locating information. And from this perspective, Sleeping Beauty's situation upon awakening is evidence that favours tails, because tails generates more awakenings and therefore more situations in which she finds herself awakened and uncertain. The problem becomes more vivid when decision-theoretic stakes are introduced. Suppose Sleeping Beauty is offered a bet each time she is awakened, a bet that pays if heads and costs if tails, and she must decide whether to accept. And now the question is what odds she should demand to make the bet fair, and halfers say she should demand even odds, 1-to-1, because the coin is fair, while thirders say she should demand 2-to-1 odds in favour of tails, because she is more likely to be betting in a tails scenario where she will lose. And when the bet is actually offered and payoffs are calculated, the thirder strategy performs better, winning more money on average. And this seems to vindicate the thirder position, to show that 1/3 is the correct credence for guiding decisions. Yet halfers respond that this merely shows a difference between epistemic credence and decision-making strategy, that the correct probability of heads is still 1/2, even if the correct betting strategy involves different odds. The Sleeping Beauty problem also raises questions about the reference class problem, the question of which group of situations Sleeping Beauty should consider herself a random member of. Should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of coin flips, in which case heads and tails are equally likely, or should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of awakening events, in which case tails is twice as likely, and different reference classes lead to different probabilities, and there is no obviously correct way to choose between them. The problem connects to issues about personal identity and indexical information about who or when or where you are, because Sleeping Beauty, upon awakening, does not learn any new dicto information, any new information about how the world is. She already knew that she would be awakened at least once, but she does gain new deci information. New information about which temporal slice of herself she currently is, new information about her location in time, and the question is whether this indexical information should change her credences, whether learning that you're currently experiencing an awakening provides evidence about the coin, even if you knew that you would experience at least one awakening. Some philosophers propose middle positions, arguing that different notions of probability are at play, and that the halfer and thirder answers are both correct relative to different interpretive frameworks, or that the question is underspecified and cannot be answered without further stipulations about what is being asked. But these conciliatory approaches satisfy neither halfers nor thirders, each of whom believes their answer is the uniquely correct one. The problem has spawned an enormous literature, with variants and extensions testing different aspects of the puzzle, versions with different probabilities for the coin, versions with different numbers of awakenings, versions where Sleeping Beauty is told what day it is, and each variant sharpens the intuitions or reveals new complications, and the debate shows no signs of resolution. Conferences are held, papers are written, arguments are refined, and the community remains divided. And this persistence suggests that the Sleeping Beauty problem may not have a single correct answer, may instead reveal an ambiguity or indeterminacy in the concept of rational credence, a place where our intuitions pull in different directions, and no amount of formalization fully captures what is at stake. Sleeping Beauty lies in the laboratory, awakened and interviewed, uncertain whether it is Monday or Tuesday, uncertain whether the coin landed heads or tails, and she must assign a probability, must decide what to believe. And the philosophers watching cannot agree on what she should say, cannot agree on whether her credence should be 1/2 or 1/3, and the experiment continues. The coin is flipped again and again. Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed again and again, and the paradox persists, a puzzle that seems simple, a question about a coin flip and some awakenings, yet contains within it deep disagreements about probability, evidence, identity, and the nature of rational belief. And no solution has won consensus, no argument has settled the debate, and Sleeping Beauty remains caught between halfers and thirders, between two ways of understanding her situation, two ways of reasoning about uncertainty, and perhaps there is no fact of the matter, no correct answer, only different frameworks that give different results. And the choice between them reflects philosophical commitments rather than mathematical necessity, and the problem endures, a touchstone in debates about probability, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a question that generates endless discussion, yet no agreement, and Sleeping Beauty wakes and wonders, and assigns her credence, and the debate continues, without end, without resolution, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical paradoxes. The split brain paradox. When one person becomes two, a patient suffers from severe epilepsy, seizures that cannot be controlled by medication, seizures that spread across the brain causing disability and danger, and as a last resort, surgeons perform a procedure called corpus callosotomy, severing the corpus callosum, the massive bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And this procedure prevents seizures from spreading, confines them to one hemisphere, and after surgery the patient seems normal, speaks and acts as before, personality intact, memories preserved, and casual observation reveals no deficit. But careful testing reveals something extraordinary, something deeply strange. The two hemispheres have been separated, are processing information independently, are operating as two separate cognitive systems. And in certain experimental conditions, the hemispheres appear to have different perceptions, different knowledge, different intentions, and the patient, who was one person with one unified consciousness, before surgery now seems to be two persons, two separate centers of awareness inhabiting a single body, and this is the split brain paradox, a puzzle about personal identity, about the unity of consciousness, about whether consciousness is divisible, and about what counts as a person, and the phenomenon, discovered and studied extensively by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, challenges our assumptions about the self, about the unity of the mind, and about whether consciousness is necessarily singular or could be plural within a single brain. Imagine the split brain setup. The patient sits before a screen and images are flashed briefly to either the left or right visual field, and because of how vision is organized, the left visual field projects to the right hemisphere and the right visual field to the left hemisphere. And normally, the hemispheres communicate through the corpus callosum, sharing information. But in split brain patients, this communication is severed, and information presented to one hemisphere is not available to the other, and the left hemisphere, which controls language, can report what it sees, but the right hemisphere, which typically lacks language, cannot speak. And this creates dissociations, cases where the person can verbally report seeing something flash to the right visual field, processed by the left hemisphere, but denies seeing anything flash to the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere, and yet the right hemisphere clearly saw the stimulus, because when asked to point with the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, the patient points accurately, and so the patient both saw and did not see, both knows and does not know, depending on which hemisphere is asked. And the unity of consciousness seems to break down, seems to split into two separate streams. The paradox becomes even more dramatic in cases of conflicting intentions, where experimenters present different instructions to each hemisphere, and the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, performs one action while the right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, performs another, and sometimes the hands conflict. One hand buttoning a shirt while the other unbuttons it, one hand reaching for an object while the other pushes it away, and the patient reports frustration, reports feeling as if the left hand has a mind of its own, is acting independently, and the verbal left hemisphere confabulates explanations, invents reasons for the left hand's actions, reasons that are false because the left hemisphere does not know what the right hemisphere is doing, does not have access to its intentions. And these cases suggest that split brain patients are not one person, but two persons. Two separate conscious agents inhabiting one body, each with their own perceptions, their own knowledge, their own goals, and the philosophical question is whether this is correct, whether splitting the brain splits the person, whether consciousness is divisible, whether personal identity can survive such division. Visualize consciousness before and after the surgery. Before surgery, there is one unified consciousness, one stream of awareness, experiences from both hemispheres integrated, and after surgery, this unity is broken. Each hemisphere processes information separately, and the question is whether there are now two consciousnesses, two subjects of experience, or whether there is still one consciousness that has become disconnected from some information, and different philosophers give different answers. Some argue that split brain patients become two persons, that severing the corpus callosum creates two centers of consciousness where there was one, and others argue that the patient remains one person, but with a divided consciousness, a consciousness that is no longer unified. And still others argue that consciousness remains unified, but access to information is divided, and the hemispheres are like modules within one consciousness rather than separate consciousnesses. The split brain paradox raises questions about the relationship between unity and consciousness, about whether consciousness is essentially unified or whether it could be divided or plural. And normal consciousness feels unified, feels like there is one subject experiencing everything, one perspective from which the world is viewed, and split brain cases challenge this unity, suggest that consciousness could be less unified than it seems, could be divided into separate streams that normally communicate but could operate independently. And this has implications for understanding the self, for whether the self is a unified entity or a collection of parts, for whether personal identity requires unity of consciousness or could survive division. One response to the paradox denies that split brain patients become two persons, argues that the left hemisphere, the language-dominant hemisphere, is the person, is the locus of consciousness and self-awareness, and the right hemisphere, while capable of processing information and guiding behavior, lacks the higher-order thought and self-awareness that constitute personhood. And so the patient remains one person, the left hemisphere person, and the right hemisphere is more like an unconscious module that influences behavior without being a separate conscious agent. And this response preserves the singularity of persons, but at the cost of denying consciousness to the right hemisphere. Another response accepts that split brain patients become two persons, accepts that there are two centers of consciousness after surgery, two subjects of experience, and argues that personal identity is not preserved through brain bisection, that splitting the brain creates two persons from one, and these two persons share a body, share a past, but are distinct in the present, have different experiences, different knowledge. And this response takes the split brain evidence seriously, treats the hemispheres as separate conscious systems, but faces the challenge of explaining how two persons can inhabit one body, how they coordinate, and whether one has priority over the other. A third response appeals to degrees of unity, argues that consciousness is not all or nothing unified, but comes in degrees, and split brain patients have less unified consciousness than normal people, but are not completely divided, are somewhere between one person and two, and unity of consciousness is a spectrum, and split brain patients are toward the divided end. And this response avoids the binary choice between one person and two, allows for partial division, for consciousness that is neither fully unified nor fully separate. And this seems to fit the evidence better, fits the fact that split brain patients seem mostly normal, seem like one person most of the time, but show signs of division in specific experimental conditions. The split brain paradox also connects to debates about personal identity over time, about what makes you the same person you were yesterday, about whether personal identity requires psychological continuity, and split brain cases are like thought experiments about fission made real, are actual cases where one person seems to become two, And philosophers have long debated fission cases, cases where a person's brain is divided and placed in two bodies, and asked whether the original person survives, and if so, which resulting person is the original. And split brain surgery is a partial realization of this scenario, does not create two separate bodies, but does create two separate information processing systems, and the philosophical puzzles about fission apply to split brain cases, puzzles about identity, about survival, about what matters in personal existence. The patient lives with split brain, navigates the world, seems normal to observers, and most of the time, the two hemispheres cooperate through shared subcortical structures, through behavioral coordination, through learned patterns, and the division is not apparent. But in the laboratory, under controlled conditions, the split emerges. The two hemispheres reveal their independence, and the paradox appears: one person or two, unified or divided, single consciousness or dual, and the answer remains disputed, remains unclear, and the split brain paradox endures as one of the most fascinating and philosophically significant phenomena in neuroscience, a real-world case that challenges our understanding of consciousness, of unity, of personal identity, and of what it means to be one person rather than many. And the severed corpus callosum sits there, two hemispheres separated, and the question persists: is this one mind or two? And the paradox remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent puzzle about the nature of self and consciousness. The stone paradox, another way to ask if God can defeat God's self. The question appears in different forms across centuries, always pointing to the same underlying puzzle about unlimited power, and one formulation asks whether an all-powerful being can create a stone so massive that even infinite strength cannot move it. And this is the stone paradox, essentially identical to the omnipotence paradox, but focusing specifically on physical objects and physical power. And the logic is the same. Either the being can create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot do, namely move the stone, or the being cannot create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot create, and in both cases the being's power has limits. And the concept of all-powerful collapses, and this formulation emphasizes the physical, intuitive aspect of the puzzle, makes it concrete, gives it visual force, because we can imagine trying to lift a stone, imagine straining against weight, and the idea of a stone too heavy for even infinite strength captures the paradox in a visceral way that abstract formulations about logical possibility sometimes miss. Imagine the stone, vast beyond imagining, extending across space, dense with compressed matter, so heavy that it curves space-time around itself, creates gravitational wells, warps reality by its mere presence, and the being approaches, grasps the stone, applies force, and the stone does not move, remains fixed in space, immovable. And this defeat, this failure, seems to show that the being is not all-powerful, and yet the being created this stone, shaped it specifically to be unmovable. And if the being can create such a stone, then the being has a power that contradicts itself, a power to create constraints that the power itself cannot overcome. And this self-defeating power seems incoherent, seems to be no power at all. And so we are driven back to the conclusion that creating such a stone is impossible. But then the being cannot create everything imaginable, cannot create every physical object, and again, the being is not all-powerful. The stone paradox is sometimes presented as a reductio ad absurdum of the concept of omnipotence, an argument that shows omnipotence is logically impossible, that no being could have unlimited power, that power must have limits, and if omnipotence is impossible, then no being is omnipotent, not even God. And this conclusion challenges traditional theology, challenges the claim that God is all-powerful, and requires either rejecting omnipotence as a divine attribute or redefining it in a way that avoids the paradox. And theologians have generally chosen the second option, have argued that omnipotence does not mean literally unlimited power, but rather maximal power consistent with logical coherence. And this means God can do anything that is logically possible, but not things that involve contradictions. And creating an unmovable stone that one can then move is a contradiction. And so God's inability to do it is not a limitation, but a reflection of logical necessity. The stone paradox also has variants involving self-limitation, questions about whether God can limit God's own power, can voluntarily give up omnipotence, can create a situation where God is no longer all-powerful. And these questions are theologically interesting because they relate to the incarnation, to the Christian claim that God became human in Christ. And being human involves limitations, involves not being omnipotent, and so did God limit divine power when becoming incarnate? And if so, does this mean God is no longer omnipotent? And if God can limit divine power, does this show that God is not essentially omnipotent? And these questions have generated extensive theological debate about the relationship between Christ's human nature and divine nature, about whether limitations apply to God as a whole or only to the human aspect. And the stone paradox in these variants touches on central mysteries of Christology and Trinitarian theology. The paradox can also be understood as a question about necessity and possibility, about whether there are constraints that even an all-powerful being must respect. And the response that God cannot do logically impossible things is a claim that logical necessity is more fundamental than power, that even God cannot violate logic. And this has implications for metaphysics, for the question of what grounds logical truths, whether they are independent of God or created by God. And if they are independent, then there is something God does not control, something that limits divine sovereignty. And if they are created by God, then the claim that God cannot violate logic becomes the claim that God cannot do what God has decided is impossible. And this seems to restore divine sovereignty, but raises questions about whether God could have made different logical truths, could have made contradictions possible. And these questions push the limits of coherent thought. Some philosophers have argued that the stone paradox shows that power itself is incoherent as an unlimited concept, that just as there cannot be a largest possible number, because any number can be exceeded by adding one, there cannot be an unlimited power, because any supposed unlimited power can be challenged by asking whether it can create a limit to itself. And this suggests that power is always relational, always defined relative to tasks and capacities. And the idea of absolute power, power not relative to anything, is an illusion, a category mistake. And so the paradox does not refute the existence of very powerful beings, does not show that God cannot be maximally powerful within the constraints of coherence, but it does show that certain formulations of omnipotence, certain claims about unlimited power, are not logically tenable. The stone sits in conceptual space, hypothetical and impossible, and the being stands before it, and the question hangs: can the stone be created? Can it be moved? And the answer shapes theology, shapes metaphysics, shapes our understanding of what power is and what limits even ultimate power must respect. And the stone paradox remains a vivid, concrete formulation of deep abstract questions about possibility, coherence, and the boundaries of divine ability. And it stands alongside the omnipotence paradox as a permanent challenge to simplistic claims about unlimited power. A reminder that even theology must answer to logic, that concepts must cohere, and that the nature of God, if God exists, is more subtle and more constrained by reason than some believers want to admit. And the stone paradox persists, waiting in every discussion of omnipotence, ready to challenge every claim that God can do anything, pushing always toward qualification, toward clarification, toward the recognition that anything means anything logically possible, and that even divine power operates within the bounds of coherence. The skeptical paradox. The ancient skeptics posed a question that has haunted philosophy ever since. How can we know anything at all? How can we justify our beliefs about the external world when those beliefs rest on foundations that are themselves uncertain, when every justification requires further justification in an endless regress? And this is the skeptical paradox, the problem that knowledge seems both necessary for action and impossible to achieve, that we cannot help but believe and claim to know, yet we cannot provide the kind of justification that would ground those claims in certainty. The skeptical argument takes many forms. One of the most powerful begins with the observation that our beliefs about the external world are based on sensory experience. We believe there is a table in front of us because we see it and touch it. But sensory experience can be misleading. Illusions and hallucinations occur. Dreams feel real while we are dreaming them. And so the mere fact that we have a certain experience does not guarantee that the world is as the experience represents it. And this means that our sensory experiences underdetermine our beliefs about the world. The same experiences could be produced by a real table, by a hallucination, by a detailed dream, or by a Cartesian demon systematically deceiving us. And if we cannot rule out these skeptical scenarios, then we cannot know that the table is real. And this reasoning applies to all our beliefs about the external world. None of them are certain. All are vulnerable to skeptical doubt. The skeptic does not claim to know that we are deceived, only that we cannot know we are not deceived. And this is enough to undermine knowledge, because knowledge seems to require not just true belief, but justified true belief. And justification seems to require being able to rule out relevant alternatives. And the skeptical scenarios are relevant alternatives that we cannot rule out, at least not without begging the question, not without assuming the very thing we are trying to prove, that our senses are reliable, that the external world exists, that we are not dreaming or deceived. The skeptical paradox is that we seem to have two incompatible intuitions. On the one hand, we are convinced that we know many things, that we know there is a table in front of us, that we know we have hands, that we know the earth is round, and these beliefs seem as certain as anything could be. And on the other hand, we find the skeptical arguments compelling. We recognize that we cannot prove we are not deceived, that the possibility of systematic error cannot be ruled out by any non-circular reasoning. And so, we oscillate between certainty and doubt, between the conviction that skepticism is absurd and the recognition that we cannot refute it. Descartes attempted to escape skepticism through his method of doubt, doubting everything that could be doubted until he reached the indubitable foundation, cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am, the one truth that even the most radical skepticism cannot undermine, because to doubt that one exists is to presuppose that there is someone doing the doubting. And from this foundation, Descartes tried to rebuild knowledge, proving the existence of God and using God's benevolence to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. But few philosophers have found this reconstruction convincing. The arguments for God's existence are controversial, and even if successful, they would not close the gap between subjective certainty and objective truth, between what seems clear and what actually is. Hume took skepticism more seriously, arguing that we have no rational justification for believing in causation, induction, or the existence of an external world, that these beliefs are products of custom and habit rather than reason, that we believe because we cannot help but believe, because our psychology compels us, not because we have good arguments. And Hume distinguished between philosophical skepticism, the theoretical position that knowledge is impossible, and practical certainty, the psychological inevitability of belief and action. And he suggested that we can acknowledge the force of skeptical arguments in the study while setting them aside in ordinary life. Though this division between theory and practice remains uncomfortable, a kind of intellectual schizophrenia where we admit that our beliefs are unjustified, yet continue to hold them anyway. Kant responded to Hume by arguing that skepticism rests on a mistake, the assumption that knowledge requires correspondence between our representations and things as they are in themselves, independent of our cognitive faculties, and Kant argued that this assumption is incoherent, that we can only know things as they appear to us, as structured by the forms of intuition and the categories of understanding, and that the question of how things are independently of these structures is meaningless, not answerable even in principle, and so skepticism about the external world is based on a confused demand, a demand for a kind of knowledge that is conceptually impossible, and Kant's transcendental idealism attempts to secure the objectivity of knowledge by relativizing it to the conditions of possible experience, making knowledge possible by making it more modest, more limited, no longer claiming to grasp things in themselves, but only things as they appear within the framework of human cognition. Contemporary epistemology has developed various responses to skepticism. Externalist theories argue that knowledge does not require the ability to rule out all skeptical scenarios. That knowledge requires only that beliefs be produced by reliable processes or track the truth in certain ways. And on these views we can know we have hands, even if we cannot prove we are not brains in vats. Because in the actual world, our perceptual beliefs are reliably formed, and the fact that we cannot distinguish the actual world from a skeptical scenario does not undermine knowledge as long as we are in fact in the actual world, and our beliefs are in fact reliably formed. Contextualist theories argue that the standards for knowledge vary with context, that in ordinary contexts skeptical scenarios are not relevant, and we can truly claim to know many things, while in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are explicitly raised, the standards become more demanding and knowledge claims become false. And this allows us to preserve both the intuition that we know many things in everyday life, and the intuition that skeptical arguments are powerful in philosophical inquiry, by treating these as claims about knowledge in different contexts with different standards. The skeptical paradox remains unresolved. No consensus has emerged about how to respond to skeptical arguments, and different philosophers find different responses more or less satisfying depending on their broader commitments about the nature of knowledge, justification, and the mind's relationship to the world. And the paradox continues to drive epistemological theorizing, forcing philosophers to clarify what they mean by knowledge, what conditions must be met for a belief to count as knowledge, and whether the concept of knowledge we ordinarily employ is coherent or whether it contains internal tensions that cannot be fully resolved. The skeptic sits in doubt, questioning everything, unable to claim knowledge, yet unable to stop believing, and the rest of us navigates between confidence and uncertainty, acting as if we know, while acknowledging in quieter moments that our knowledge rests on foundations that are less secure than we would like, that the gap between appearance and reality cannot be fully closed, that the possibility of error cannot be eliminated, and that knowledge, if it exists at all, is more fragile and more difficult to achieve than common sense suggests. And the paradox endures, the ancient puzzle that will not die, the question that philosophy cannot answer but cannot stop asking, and we continue to believe, to claim to know, to act with confidence, while the skeptic watches and waits, reminding us that certainty is elusive, that doubt is always possible, that the foundations of knowledge are shakier than they appear. The transfer principle. Paradox when powerlessness spreads like a virus. A philosopher constructs a principle about power and control, about what things are and are not within our ability to affect. And the principle seems obviously true, seems like basic logic about how powerlessness transfers. And the principle says that if you have no power over one fact and that fact entails another fact and you have no power over the entailment itself, then you have no power over the second fact either. Powerlessness transfers across entailment, spreads from premises to conclusions, and this transfer principle is the backbone of the consequence argument for incompatibilism, is what allows the argument to move from our powerlessness over the past and laws to our powerlessness over the present. And yet, compatibilists deny this principle, argue that it is false, that powerlessness does not always transfer, that you can have power over a fact even when that fact is entailed by facts you have no power over. And this creates a paradox, because the transfer principle seems undeniable, seems like it must be true, and yet if it is true, then compatibilism is false. And if it is false, then the consequence argument fails, and both options are difficult. Both require accepting something counterintuitive, and this is the transfer principle paradox. The puzzle about whether powerlessness transfers, whether the principle is a logical truth or contains hidden errors, and the paradox sits at the heart of the free will debate, determines whether incompatibilism or compatibilism wins. And no consensus has emerged. Philosophers remain divided, and the transfer principle stands as one of the most contested principles in metaphysics. A principle that seems obvious, but whose truth determines fundamental questions about freedom and determinism. Imagine the transfer principle applied to a simple case. You have no power over the fact that there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and the Big Bang plus the laws of physics entail the current state of the universe, including your current action, and you have no power over the laws of physics, and you have no power over the entailment itself, over the fact that the Big Bang and laws entail your action. And so by the transfer principle, you have no power over your current action. Your action is not up to you, is not within your control, and if you have no power over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this reasoning seems airtight, seems like it must be correct, and yet compatibilists deny the conclusion, deny that determinism eliminates power, and so they must deny the transfer principle, must argue that power does not transfer in the way the principle claims. The transfer principle can be stated formally using symbols. If no one has power over P, and P entails Q, and no one has power over the entailment from P to Q, then no one has power over Q. And this seems like a valid rule of inference about power, seems like it should be uncontroversial, and yet compatibilists argue it contains a subtle error, a conflation of different senses of power, or an invalid inference structure, or an equivocation on what it means to have power over something. And these objections attempt to show that the transfer principle, despite its intuitive appeal, is actually false, and powerlessness does not always transfer. Visualize powerlessness as a property that might or might not spread from one fact to another, like a contagion that sometimes transmits and sometimes does not. And the transfer principle says the contagion always spreads across entailment, always passes from premises to conclusions. But compatibilists say transmission is blocked under certain conditions, say that the link between premises and conclusions does not preserve powerlessness in the way incompatibilists claim. And this disagreement is fundamental, shapes the entire free will debate, determines which arguments succeed and which fail. One compatibilist response to the transfer principle distinguishes between two kinds of power: the power to make something the case and the power to have made something the case, and argues that the transfer principle conflates these, that while you lack the power to have made the past different, you do have the power to make the present what it is, and the presence being entailed by the past does not eliminate your power over the present, does not make your action not up to you, and the transfer principle fails because it moves illegitimately from past-directed power to present-directed power, treats them as the same when they are different. And once the distinction is recognized, the principle's apparent validity disappears. Another compatibilist response argues that the transfer principle uses the wrong notion of power, defines power in terms of ability to falsify facts, ability to make false things that are true. And this notion of power is inappropriate, is not what matters for freedom. And the right notion of power is counterfactual power. Power such that, if you had chosen differently, then different things would have happened. And counterfactual power is not governed by the transfer principle, does not transfer from premises to conclusions in the way the principle claims. And so the principle fails as a constraint on freedom, fails to show that determinism eliminates the kind of power needed for responsibility. A third compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle for some inferences but denies it for others, argues that the principle is valid in some contexts but invalid in others, and the contexts where it fails are precisely the contexts involving agency and choice, contexts where the agent is part of the causal chain between past and present, and in these contexts the agent's involvement blocks transfer, prevents powerlessness from spreading from past to present. And the transfer principle is not a universal logical truth, but a context-sensitive inference rule that admits exceptions. Incompatibilists defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist objections are sophistical, involve verbal tricks and redefinitions that obscure the real issue, and the transfer principle is valid, is a genuine constraint on power. And if you have no power over the past and laws, then you have no power over anything entailed by them. And this includes your present actions. And so determinism eliminates power, eliminates control, and compatibilism is false. And the transfer principle stands as a cornerstone of incompatibilist arguments, a principle that compatibilists cannot successfully reject without abandoning common sense about how powerlessness works. The debate over the transfer principle has generated enormous technical literature, philosophers constructing formal versions of the principle in modal logic, testing it against various cases, proposing refinements and modifications, and no consensus has emerged, and the debate reveals deep disagreements about the nature of power, about what it means to have something be up to you, about whether power is a metaphysical notion or an epistemic notion. And these disagreements shape views about free will, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. The transfer principle also connects to debates about counterfactuals, about what would have happened if things had been different, because compatibilists often appeal to counterfactuals to explain power, say that you have power over your action because if you'd chosen differently, you would have acted differently. And incompatibilists respond that these counterfactuals do not show genuine power. Because the antecedent is impossible given determinism, you could not have chosen differently given the past and laws, and so the counterfactuals are vacuous, and compatibilist power is illusory, and the transfer principle makes this explicit, shows that compatibilist power is not real power because it is entailed by facts you have no power over. The principle stands at the centre of the free will debate, determines whether the consequence argument succeeds, whether incompatibilism is established, whether determinism is compatible with freedom, and both sides have powerful arguments. Both can make their case seem compelling, and the stalemate persists, and perhaps this reflects something deep. Perhaps the transfer principle is one of those principles where our intuitions are divided, where different ways of thinking about power lead to different judgments, and no argument can establish the principle or refute it definitively, and we are left with competing perspectives, incompatibilist and compatibilist, each coherent internally, each unsatisfying to those who adopt the other, and the transfer principle paradox endures, a principle that seems both obviously true and demonstrably false, depending on how you think about power and control. And the paradox remains unresolved, remains central to debates about free will, and powerlessness spreads or does not spread, transfers or is blocked, and which answer is correct determines whether we are free, and the transfer principle stands, controversial and crucial, a principle whose truth or falsity shapes fundamental metaphysical questions about agency and determinism. The temporal loop paradox. Time travel narratives often stumble into a peculiar trap, one where causation forms a perfect circle with no discernible beginning, and this is the temporal loop paradox, a scenario where events cause themselves through the mechanism of time travel, creating a chain of causation that has no origin outside the loop itself. Imagine a scientist who receives a mysterious package containing detailed blueprints for a time machine blueprints that are far beyond anything current science could produce, and the scientist follows these instructions exactly, building the machine over many years, and once it is complete they use it to travel back in time to their younger self, where they mail the very same blueprints that they received decades earlier, and so the blueprints travel from future to past in an endless cycle, created by no one, authored by no one, simply existing within the loop. The paradox is that the information has no source. It was never invented or discovered. It merely circulates through time, and the same pattern can apply to objects, people, or even entire chains of events, creating closed causal loops, where every event is both cause and effect, where nothing enters the loop from outside and nothing leaves, a self-contained system that violates the intuition that everything must have an origin, that causes must precede effects in a linear chain stretching back to some first cause. Some physicists argue that such loops are permitted by the equations of general relativity, which allow for closed time-like curves under certain exotic conditions, space-time paths that circle back on themselves so that travelling forward in time eventually brings you to your own past. And if such curves exist, then temporal loops are possible, strange but not contradictory. Others find the loops deeply troubling, a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that everything must have an explanation, that there must be a reason why the blueprints contain the information they do, but in a temporal loop, there is no reason, no explanation. The information simply is, trapped in eternal recurrence. The loop also raises questions about entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, which states that disorder always increases over time. Yet in a temporal loop, information or objects would circulate indefinitely, without decay, never accumulating errors, never losing coherence. And this seems to violate the fundamental arrow of time that thermodynamics imposes. Some theorists suggest that quantum mechanics might prevent such loops, that the probabilistic nature of quantum events would introduce small variations each time the loop repeats, causing the information to degrade over successive iterations until the loop breaks down, while others propose that consistency conditions might force the loop to be stable, that only perfectly self-consistent loops can exist, and any deviation would create contradictions that the universe does not permit. The temporal loop paradox differs from the predestination paradox in emphasis, where predestination focuses on the inevitability of events and the loss of free will. The temporal loop focuses on the absence of origins and the circular nature of causation. And both paradoxes share the unsettling feature that time travel does not change the past because the time traveller was always part of that past, their actions already woven into the fabric of history. The loop sits outside normal causation, neither created nor destroyed, neither beginning nor ending, a strange attractor in the space of possible timelines, and it forces confrontation with the question of whether the universe requires ultimate origins, whether infinite regress is possible, whether some things can simply be without explanation, and whether time is truly linear, or whether it can fold back on itself in ways that make causation circular rather than hierarchical. The temporal loop remains a staple of science fiction and a puzzle for philosophers and physicists, a scenario that feels impossible, yet may be consistent with the laws of nature, a reminder that time is stranger than common sense suggests, and that the arrow of causation we perceive, flowing from past to future, from cause to effect, may not be as fundamental as we believe, may not be the only way events can be structured, and that reality may permit loops and circles where intuition insists there should be lines. The Swampman Paradox. Lightning strikes a swamp, and in that instant a man walking through the marsh is vaporized, his body reduced to scattered atoms. And by an extraordinary coincidence, the same lightning strike rearranges nearby organic matter into an exact duplicate of the man, molecule for molecule, synapse for synapse, every memory and personality trait perfectly replicated by chance. and this duplicate, called Swampman by philosopher Donald Davidson, who devised the thought experiment, opens his eyes and continues walking, unaware that anything has happened, believing himself to be the man who entered the swamp moments before. The question that follows is unsettling. Is Swampman the same person as the man who was destroyed? And if not, then what is he? Does he have thoughts, beliefs, desires? Or are his internal states merely physical patterns that resemble mental states without actually being mental states? And this paradox strikes at theories of meaning, content, and personal identity, revealing tensions between physical and historical criteria for mental properties. Davidson argued that Swampman does not have thoughts or beliefs, at least not initially, because the content of mental states depends on causal history, on how those states were formed through interaction with the environment and the linguistic community, and Swampman has no history, no past interactions, no causal connections to the world. His brain states are physically identical to the original man's, but they lack the historical grounding that gives those states their meaning. And so when Swampman seems to think about his wife, he is not actually thinking about anyone, because his internal states have no reference, no connection to the people and things they superficially resemble. This position reflects a broader externalist view in philosophy of mind, the idea that mental content is not determined solely by what is inside the head, but also by external relations, by the history of how beliefs and concepts were acquired, by the environment in which the organism evolved and learned, and so two physically identical beings could have different mental contents, or one could have mental contents while the other has none, depending on their causal histories. Others find this conclusion absurd, arguing that if Swampman is physically identical to the original man, then he must have the same mental states, that consciousness and thought supervene on physical structure, that duplicating the brain duplicates the mind, and that causal history, while perhaps relevant to the origin of mental content, is not necessary for its presence at a given moment. And so Swampman thinks and believes and desires just as the original man did, and any theory that denies this is privileging abstract historical facts over concrete present reality. The Swampman paradox also raises questions about personal identity. If Swampman is not the original man, then he is a distinct person who happens to have identical memories and personality, but those memories are false. They are not his memories because he did not live through the events they seem to record. He came into existence mere seconds ago with a fabricated past, and yet, from the inside, from Swampman's perspective, everything feels continuous and real, and he has no way of discovering the truth about his origins. And this suggests that memory and subjective continuity may be insufficient for personal identity. That being the same person requires some kind of physical or causal continuity that Swampman lacks. The paradox connects to debates about functionalism in philosophy of mind, the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by what they do and how they interact with other states, rather than by their physical composition or history. And functionalism seems to imply that Swampman does have mental states because his brain plays the same functional roles as the original man's brain, and yet this conflicts with externalist intuitions about content. The Swampman thought experiment has been used to explore issues in semantics, the philosophy of language, and theories of reference, showing that our ordinary assumptions about meaning and thought are more complex and fragile than they appear, that the relationship between words and world, between inner states and outer reality, is mediated by history and causation in ways that a snapshot of physical structure cannot capture. Swampman walks through the swamp, indistinguishable from the man who died, living a life that feels real, engaging in actions that seem meaningful, and yet, according to some theories, he is hollow, a zombie of sorts, a being without genuine content, without real thoughts, a perfect imitation of a person who is not quite a person, and the paradox lingers as a question about what makes mental states meaningful. What grounds reference and belief, and whether the inside of the mind is sufficient to constitute a mind, or whether minds require roots in history, connections to the world, threads of causation that link present thoughts to past experiences in ways that brute physical similarity cannot replace. The third man argument, why Plato's theory spawns infinite forms. A philosopher named Aristotle attacks his teacher, Plato's theory of forms, attacks the idea that universal properties like tallness or humanity exist as perfect eternal forms in a separate realm, and Aristotle constructs a devastating objection, an argument that shows Plato's theory generates an infinite regress, creates an endless multiplication of forms, and the argument is called the third man argument, named after an example involving men, and the argument goes as follows. Plato says that multiple tall men are tall because they participate in the form of tallness. They resemble the form. They share something with the eternal perfect tall. And now Aristotle asks, if multiple men and the form of man are all men in some sense, then what explains their similarity? What makes them all instances of manhood? And Plato's theory requires positing another form, a second form of man that the first form and the particular men all participate in, and this second form explains why the first form and the particulars are all men, but now we have the second form and the particular men and the first form, and these are all men, and what explains their similarity? And Plato's theory requires a third form, a third man, and this generates infinite regress, infinite forms, and the explanation never grounds, never stops, never reaches a final form that explains all similarity. And this is the third man argument, a reductio ad absurdum of Plato's theory of forms, showing that the theory is self-defeating, generates infinite regress, and cannot explain what it was designed to explain. Imagine the structure. Multiple particular tall men exist. Call them Tom and Tim and Ted, and they are all tall, and Plato explains this by saying they all participate in the form of tallness. Call it Form 1, and Form 1 is the perfect tall, is what makes Tom and Tim and Ted tall, and they are tall by resembling Form 1, but now notice that Tom and Tim and Ted and Form 1 are all tall, all share the property of tallness, and by Plato's own reasoning this similarity requires explanation, requires a form that they all participate in, and so we need Form 2, a second form of tallness that explains why Form 1 and the particular men are all tall. And now we have Form 1 and Form 2 and the particular men, all tall. And this similarity requires explanation, requires Form 3. And the regress continues infinitely. And tallness is not explained by a single form, but by an infinite hierarchy of forms. And this infinite hierarchy is vicious, is problematic, because each form was supposed to explain similarity, was supposed to ground the property, but the grounding never completes, requires further forms endlessly. The third man argument reveals a deep problem with Plato's theory. The problem is that forms are supposed to explain why particulars have properties, but forms themselves have properties. The form of tallness is tall, the form of beauty is beautiful. And if forms have the properties they explain, then they fall under their own domain, are subject to the same explanation they provide. And this creates regress, creates the need for higher order forms. And the regress is vicious because it undermines the explanatory role of forms, shows that forms do not actually explain anything, do not provide ultimate ground, and Aristotle uses this argument to reject Plato's separate forms, to argue that forms must exist in particulars, not in a separate realm, and that resemblance is primitive, not explained by participation in forms. Visualize the regress as a ladder. At the bottom are particular tall men. At the next rung is Form 1 that explains their tallness. At the next rung is Form 2 that explains why Form 1 and the men are all tall. At the next rung is Form 3, and the ladder extends infinitely upward, never reaching a final rung, never grounding the explanation. And climbing the ladder does not bring us closer to understanding tallness, only pushes the question higher. And the third man argument shows that Plato's theory is a ladder to nowhere, is an explanatory structure that generates infinite regress rather than providing genuine explanation. One response to the third man argument, a response Plato himself may have considered, denies that forms have the properties they explain, denies that the form of tallness is itself tall, argues that forms are paradigms, are perfect standards, but do not instantiate the properties they ground. And the form of tallness is not tall, but is what tallness is the nature of tallness. And particulars are tall by resembling the form, but the form does not resemble itself, does not participate in itself. And this blocks the regress because there is no need to explain why the form and the particulars are both tall. The form is not tall, and only particulars are tall, and the regress does not start. And this response requires distinguishing between being a property and instantiating a property, requires that forms be properties without having properties. And this is metaphysically subtle, requires careful formulation. Another response accepts that forms instantiate themselves, accepts that the form of tallness is tall, but denies that this requires further explanation, denies that the form and particulars being tall needs to be explained by a higher form, argues that the form is self-explanatory, is the ground of tallness, and the fact that the form is tall is not a further fact requiring explanation, but is constitutive of what the form is, and this response blocks the regress by denying the premise that all similarity requires explanation, allows that some similarity is primitive, is not explained by further forms, and the form of tallness being tall is primitive, grounds other tallness, but does not itself need grounding. A third response from Aristotle's own position rejects Plato's separate forms entirely, argues that universals exist in particulars not in a separate realm, and tallness exists in tall men, is immanent, not transcendent. And this avoids the third man regress because there is no separate form that is itself tall. Forms are not separate entities but are aspects of particulars. And the regress does not arise because there is no form that shares the property with particulars. And Aristotle's immanent realism avoids the third man argument by changing the metaphysical location of universals, putting them in the world rather than in a separate realm. The third man argument has influenced debates about universals throughout history, has been revived and refined, has been applied to various theories of properties, and the argument shows that any theory that posits entities to explain resemblance must be careful not to make those entities instances of what they explain, must avoid the structure that generates regress, and modern theories of properties, trope theories, and resemblance nominalism and immanent realism all have been shaped by the need to avoid the third man regress. All have been designed to explain properties without generating infinite hierarchies. The argument also appears in discussions of sets and classes, because Russell's paradox is structurally similar, asks whether the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contains itself, and generates contradiction, and avoiding Russell's paradox requires type theory, or other restrictions that prevent sets from being members of themselves. And these restrictions are analogous to the restrictions needed to avoid the third man argument, are ways of preventing entities from falling under their own domain. And both paradoxes show that self-reference creates problems, creates regress or contradiction, and metaphysical theories must be structured to avoid self-application. Plato's forms stand in the realm of perfect ideas, tall and beautiful and just, and the particular men stand in the physical world, tall by participation in forms, and the third man appears. The need for a second form to explain why the first form and the men are similar, and then the fourth man, the fifth, infinite, regress, and Aristotle's argument stands, devastating and elegant, showing that Plato's theory contains internal incoherence, generates infinite regress, and cannot provide the explanation it promises. And the third man argument endures as one of the most famous arguments in ancient philosophy, an argument that shaped the development of metaphysics, influenced all subsequent theories of universals, and remains a permanent challenge to any theory that posits abstract entities to explain similarity. And the third man waits, hovering above the first and second, and the regress continues, and Plato's theory falters, and the argument persists.